Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. Today I want to take a dive into the Steam Deck. While there have already been numerous guides and breakdowns released since even before the deck was publicly released, I thought I'd go ahead and tone it down and see how well the Steam Deck performs for the average consumer. You probably know by now that this is a very powerful machine for its size and that it's very capable of handling a variety of configurations with various degrees of tweaking. Then again, what about the people out there that just want to play games without the troubles of tedious tinkering? So that will be my focus today as I share my experience with you. Now, it should be said up front that the Steam Deck is currently not easy to come by. I, like many, was literally counting down the minutes for reservations to become available. And like many again, I witnessed the struggle of Steam's payment service to handle the immediate barrage of orders being placed. Eventually I was able to get my reservation through after a couple of hours, and even though I had placed my reservation within that time, I didn't get my order confirmation until May 19th. Thankfully, my wife had managed to make a reservation sooner than I, and so my early birthday present arrived 1 week earlier on May 12th. Of course, my reason for going on with that story was not just to ramble on, but to give you an example of how far out some of these orders go. Reservations began on July 16th, 2021. Orders were delayed until February 2022. And many first-day reservations are still waiting with an estimated order window of the third quarter of this year. Valve has been ramping up production and shipping after seeing just how much interest this big little device has gained. But if you place your $5 reservation now, as of the release of this video, you'll still be looking at an expected order availability of October or later. Of course, you could pay a scalper for twice as much or more, but then you're taking a pretty high risk with no guarantee or support. Honestly, that's not something I'd be willing to risk $1,000 on. That said, hopefully the rest of this review will help convince you on whether or not the Steam Deck is worth the wait. Out of the box, the Steam Deck comes with some fairly sparse instructions and a neat little booklet with the standard safety warnings. We'd ordered the 512 gig model with the premium anti-glare etched glass and exclusive carrying case. After a frighteningly long first boot time, setting up the Steam Deck was just as simple as any new phone. Just punch in a few details like your time zone, preferred language, Wi-Fi, Steam username and password, and you're good to go. It wasn't long before I was greeted with a firmware update which installed easily thanks to the simple and controller-friendly menu. I found the overall interface to be very familiar for anyone who has used Steam in big picture mode. Installing the SD card was also just as easy as popping it in and formatting it through the intuitive interface. The only major hiccup I ran into was that my Wi-Fi connection was very hit and miss at times. Fortunately, Valve had already noted that this is a Wi-Fi power-saving bug that they are actively working to fix, and provided some easy instructions on how to activate dev mode and turn Wi-Fi power-saving off in the meantime. For a handheld, the Steam Deck is not small by any means. With dimensions of 11.7 inches wide and 4.6 inches tall, you're essentially looking at a small to mid-sized tablet with controllers on the sides. It's certainly not something you're going to be carrying in your pockets unless you're still into Jinkos. Fortunately, it does feel lighter than it looks. The build quality feels solid and isn't uncomfortable for my adult-sized hands. For the most part, all of the controls feel nicely placed, including the back buttons and trackpads. I do find that the most comfortable position for holding it is to have my elbows resting on something. Holding it up while standing or lying down will probably make your arms tired after a while. Overall, it ends up being a bit of a compromise between hand and eye comfort, with the latter making a decent win. The 7-inch screen is a real treat for playing games that are generally made for viewing on a larger monitor, and the anti-glare glass is delightful. Of course, one of the biggest questions on everybody's mind is, how well does it run games? The Steam Deck runs on a modified version of Arch Linux, which may sound intimidating to many people out there who aren't familiar with Linux operating systems. Valve proudly notes that you aren't restricted to this operating system, defining the Steam Deck to be more like a PC. Although most common users probably won't feel comfortable or even interested in the process of installing Windows 10. But how easily can a Windows-based game be run in a Linux environment? Pretty easy actually, thanks to the compatibility features provided by Proton. Of course, your experience will vary depending on what games you want to play. Installing games through the Steam interface is a breeze, but it isn't perfect. At the time of writing this, Valve has reported that roughly 19% of my Steam library runs perfectly, with another 21% being playable with a few minor hitches, and another 21% being considered unplayable on the Steam Deck. Seems like a small percentage, but it should also be considered that 40% of the games in my library have yet to be verified, and many of the unplayable games are due to them being VR titles. Another thing to consider is that these verifications aren't always that accurate. I've installed games that were reported to work well, but then struggled to get them to run at all. Likewise, I've installed games that were noted as not working, and some of them worked just fine. Fortunately, ProtonDB offers you a peek at what other users experienced, including deck-specific reports. So, while you may experience some heartache over a few games that fail to run correctly, I'm happy to say that most of the games that I've tested work great off the bat with no tweaking whatsoever. These include Resident Evil 4, Transformers Devastation, Burnout Paradise, and one of my current favorites, Skatebird. Games like Assassin's Creed 3 gave me a bit of trouble with the Ubisoft Connect login, but otherwise ran very well once that was taken care of. But what about other PC storefronts? Most don't have much support for Linux, but there are some cross-platform launchers that you can use to get non-Steam games installed and running on the Steam Deck. The first one I tried was the Heroic launcher, which supports both GOG and Epic. This was actually very easy to install and set up by use of the Steam Deck's desktop mode. Simply log into your accounts and install the games from your library. You can set a Steam shortcut to the launcher so that you can access and run the installed games. These will also use Proton compatibility, so your experience will still depend on support for that game. Linux-based games should be fine, obviously, and itch.io conveniently provides a Linux-based installer, although I still had a bit of trouble running some Linux games that I assumed should have worked fine. This could have just been something that I did incorrectly, but it should be pointed out considering this video is about ease of use. The main takeaway is, installing non-Steam games will require a bit of work in desktop mode, whereas installing games directly from Steam is obviously the easiest process. Now, if there's one thing that the Steam Deck should be able to do easily, it's cloud gaming. Well, it doesn't. Not yet, at least. The problem is that the current popular browsers don't seem to support Steam Deck's built-in controls. Not only that, but I couldn't even get external controllers working in Stadia through the Chrome browser. The only thing that did work was the Stadia controller, and since that connects over Wi-Fi rather than the device you're streaming Stadia to, I found my Steam Deck starting to go into sleep mode due to the length of time spent with no user input. Some have used the Steam Deck's robust controller configuration to map the buttons to PC-style keyboard controls, but I found that to be an imperfect workaround for something that should be much easier. Ironically, it was later reported that Microsoft had developed a beta version of their Edge browser for Linux that does provide the needed controller support to the Steam Deck, adding better accessibility to platforms like Game Pass and Stadia. It will require a couple of minor configuration tweaks, but I can personally confirm that it works very well. I'd mentioned before that I had some trouble with the Wi-Fi power saving mode. I also had some trouble connecting my Xbox controller over Bluetooth, or even with an official USB receiver. To get that working, I had to update the firmware on the controller. However, I was able to pair my 8-bit Do controller with ease, and of course, the Steam controller connected flawlessly as expected. Using an inexpensive USB-C adapter that I had originally gotten off of Amazon for my iPad, I had no trouble connecting my USB mouse, keyboard, and HDMI to my monitor and TV. Using the included charger, I was able to draw enough power to have everything connected while still charging the deck battery. While we still have to look forward to the official dock to become available, I can say that it was fairly easy to connect external devices, both wired and wireless. And once I worked out the issues with controls in cloud gaming, I can say that the streaming quality was excellent. Now, one of the biggest conversation pieces centered around the Steam Deck is how well it handles emulation. Is it really the Switch killer? No, not really, but it does do a phenomenal job with emulation on most of the older platforms. So how easy is it to set up? Thankfully, we've already gotten some fantastic apps that can automate the vast majority of the process. EmuDeck can be used to install and pre-configure literally every emulator you could possibly need. It sets both ROM and BIOS folders for you to copy everything to, and preps you to run the Steam ROM manager if you want to launch all of your games from Steam. Steam ROM Manager will scan your ROM folders and create individual shortcuts directly into your Steam library, and will even attempt to set custom banners for you. And if, like me, you don't want to clutter up your Steam library with too much, you can also use Emulation Station Desktop Edition, which is a fantastic front end for any system. Sounds easy, right? Well, mostly. The entire process has to be done in desktop mode, and you will want to use a mouse and keyboard for that. And while most of it is automated, you still have to manually transfer all of your ROMs to their respective folders on the deck, set BIOS files as needed, and fix the art and metadata for those occasionally misidentified games. It can get a bit tedious, although if you're even remotely familiar with emulation, it shouldn't be too difficult to process. And since we've already mentioned the desktop mode a couple of times, I will say that I had a pretty good experience using the KDE Plasma interface. Everything should seem familiar to those who are used to the Windows 10 environment. Things do get easier if you have a bit of experience with Linux, but even if you don't, the differences shouldn't hold you back too much. Firefox was the pre-installed browser, Dolphin is the name of the file browser, not to be confused with the Wii/GameCube emulator, and a variety of useful free software can be installed using the Discover app. Honestly, for most casual web browsing, streaming media, and various Office applications, the Steam Desktop Mode challenge shouldn't be too challenging. Compared to other gaming handhelds, there are a ton on the market these days, some of which have comparable specs to the Steam Deck, and generally a bigger price tag as well. But it really should be considered that the Steam Deck is not going to be for everyone, primarily based on the size of it. A smaller handheld will easily give you better comfort and portability, but also comes with the sacrifice of less overall power. The Steam Deck isn't about to replace my PlayStation Vita or Nintendo 3DS. So how do I intend to use it? Honestly, I do so much work on my PC every day that sometimes I just need to get away from it. In that respect, I do intend to use it much like I would with the Switch, with my butt firmly planted on the couch. So far, it has been a great way to play my PC games away from the PC. I'll probably still prefer playing FPS games with a mouse and keyboard, but I'm assuming most other games should do well with the control options on the Steam Deck, whether I have it connected to my television or have it right in my hands. If I feel that gaming itch, I can bring it with me to the office, but I probably won't be taking it out to any public parks or using it on the metro, considering how much it costs. If you're playing a game that requires an internet connection, you always have the option to set tethering on your phone if you don't have a secure Wi-Fi network nearby. If you do most of your gaming through Steam and you're in the market for a big beefy handheld that packs a lot of power for a competitive price, the Steam Deck is an obvious win. But if you fall outside of that category and maybe feel a bit less tech savvy to get other platforms working, hopefully this review gives you a better idea of whether or not the Steam Deck is for you. That's it for this session. I hope you all enjoyed. Until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.